All right.
Let me just, while she's finishing that, this is the first time I've taught this class with a biologist. I'm very excited that we're going to have much stronger input on ecology. And so what did she ask me to do? She asked me to, in 45 minutes or so, do about a lecture that would really take about 4 courses. Outside, she asked me to be a geologist and a historian and everything else. Thanks, Marianne, but we'll try the best that we can. And I don't mind being interrupted as we go through this. I'll try to do the best as I can to give you this whirlwind tour. I'll try to get everything, all these things moved around here before I start. And so I think my goal here, in hopefully about 45 minutes, it might be a little bit longer than that, is to take you sort of the introduction. I think the Neotropical Companion book is really a nice book that provides a kind of a big overview, and hopefully you had a chance to read that. I know most of you did because of your discussion comments, and sort of sets the stage. And so I'd like to kind of take a look at Amazon across time, deep time, essentially to start out, and then kind of do just a really kind of real introductory look into the current Amazon and what it's like in terms of ecosystems, climate, and soils, and then talk a little bit about the structure and the dynamics of the Amazon ecosystem, its diversity, and then I'd like to end with just a few thoughts, very few thoughts, because we're going to talk a lot about this over the course, but how the Amazon is changing, and again, from sort of from a personal perspective, and some of the research that I've been involved in or people that I've worked with, and I'll give just a couple of examples at the end about that. And let me see if we do this here. Does that work? There we go. And so we're going to have this funny little thing up there that will drive us nuts the whole time. But arguably, the Amazon is the most species-rich terrestrial ecosystem in the world, and I don't think anybody really disputes that. I think what is a lot of debate is how that diversity was generated and how it's maintained over time. But as a tropical ecologist that really cut my tropical teeth, I guess, in Costa Rica. When I went to Costa Rica for the first time, I was just, incredibly, actually I went to Panama first, then to Costa Rica. I was incredibly overwhelmed, because all of these birds, I study birds in the tropical forest, most of them were different except for those migrants that spend their winter in tropical sites and then move back up north. But in the Costa Rican forest that I was used to working, there were like 2 of these guys. And then when I moved to South America, and the forest I'm working in now, there are 12 of those guys. So even Costa Rica, which was recognized as being an incredibly diverse place, does not compare by any stretch of the imagination to forests in the Amazon. And of course, the insect diversity is tremendous. And when I was a graduate student, what we were talking a lot about in those days, and this was in the kind of late 1970s, early 1980s, we were talking about these diversity gradients. I mean, a lot of people were publishing on this trend that everybody seemed to notice, that as you decrease in latitude, you increase in diversity at a site, this latitudinal diversity gradient. And it gets repeated over and over and over again on different taxa. There are a few exceptions, but generally, as you decrease in latitude, you increase in diversity. And so that was kind of a really big discussion among graduate students of my day. And of course, there's a lot of complexity to that diversity gradient. For example, from some of Al Gentry's work, and he was at the Missouri Botanical Garden, he did a lot of work with forest plots and looking at the diversity of trees in those plots. And you can see by this graph that it depends to a certain extent. If you get more diversity when you're in a moist forest than when you're in a tropical dry forest of the same latitude. So there's, should send off some things in your head that, there's things that can, change that diversity at particular sites. And while I mention that, I guess what I want you to do as you sit and listen to this lecture is think about things, jot down things that kind of surprise you, that maybe that you weren't aware of, and maybe all of us will be able to answer, all of you And then perhaps some of the kind of what hits you as kind of keywords or topics that relate maybe your, to your view and your perspective of the Amazon as well. And maybe we can talk about some of those things as we go on. And then maybe parallels for those of you that are social scientists. If we talk about some processes, what might be some parallels to those processes, perhaps from your perspective again, as a social scientist, or perhaps as a natural scientist working on different kinds of organisms if we're specific to one kind of organism. But to really to understand the diversity in the Amazon, you really need to go back in time and realize the Amazon is, what we view the Amazon today was really very, very different over long periods of time. And of course, I think most of you know that the continents were at one time, all scrunched together in the Pangaean age about 225 million years ago. And then when they began to separate, about 200 million years ago, we separated up into the northern zones being Laurasia, and then we had Gondwanaland, and South America and Africa were part of Gondwanaland. And so imagine, this is where the mouth of the Amazon was, right? Well, that can't be the mouth of the Amazon if it's right up against Africa. And it's a sort of a connected continent. And in fact, when you think about that, and you think about that continent the way it is, if you're right in the middle there, well, actually it's tilted a little bit this way to the west, right? So if any sort of water's going to flow, it's going to flow to the west rather than to the east side of what we consider the eastern coast of South America. And in fact, the Amazon really wasn't the Amazon at that time. It was just kind of this giant gulf that opened westward onto the Pacific Ocean. And then once we start going, into the separation of Gondwanaland, again, the land was dry, but the rivers were flowing to the Pacific. So this is kind of a diagram so you have the African plate and you have South America, but at this time they're together. So when water is flowing, it's flowing west into the Pacific Ocean. This is about 200 million years ago during the Jurassic. There are no Andes Mountains at this point, nothing to stop that water from essentially going to the west. Well, as the plates were beginning to move, what happened is the American plate began to run into the Nazca plate. And the Nazca plate, being smaller, is subjected under the American plate, and this was the beginning of the rise of the Andes. And then all of a sudden, what happened is you stopped that water flow from going to the west. And meanwhile, South America is beginning to split off from Africa as well. And so you get the rise of the Andes holding back that water, and water begins to kind of fill up in the continent of South America. I have too many buttons to push. Do you want to? There we go. I think I tried the downs and they don't work. So this is kind of a series of graphs that will take you from about 65 million years ago to more or less, close to the present, about 2.5 million years ago. And so at this point, South America, up in the upper left, has split from Africa, and it's really an island. South America is this big, huge island. It's not yet connected to North America and Central America through Panama. And you can see in here that we're beginning, the Andes are beginning to rise here, primarily more a little bit to the south, and there's some rising up here to the kind of the northwest part, but there's not much happening up to the north. And so you're beginning to get this blockage. And prior to this sort of splitting from Africa, what you had really was the continental divide, essentially being over here. But as it splits and as it's running into the Pacific plate and the Andes are rising, you're getting the continental divide beginning to shift more and more westward, okay, over time. And about 33 to 23 million years ago, what you had is you did have some water flowing essentially to the east, but a lot of the water was flowing out here to the west, and as these Andes began to rise, it actually got diverted here to up to the northwest area and exiting over here. And then there ended up being kind of a break in the Pacific plates, and I can't remember exactly the names of all those, but they kind of broke up again a little bit, shifting where a lot of the subduction was happening. And so by now you can see that these Andes, particularly in the south, these are the older part of the Andes, are, you know, getting pretty well established, whereas here they're just really beginning to rise. Well, it was about 23 million years ago when those plates sort of shifted a little bit, and now you can see more mountain building beginning to happen in the northwest part of South America. And when these mountains began to build up over here in the northwest part, it began to close off that exit for the water as it goes into the northwest area here. And what happened with western Amazonia is all of a sudden it became this big wetland. David would have loved it. Beautiful. A big wetland, much like what, you know, we think of the Pantanal today in Brazil. So wetland, lakes, all this other things. And you still, as you can see, you still have some waters flowing essentially to the west and some waters flowing to the east, and the continental divide is roughly about halfway through South America. And so when this is about 24 million years ago. Again, the Andes are much higher at this point, and what's happening with these young Andes with rainfall and so forth, you're getting a lot of sediments coming off the Andes and flowing down into that wetland area in western Amazonia, and it's building up. A lot of sediments are building up, and this is really what is the soils today of the Amazon. So there are a lot of the lattisols and other soils we'll talk about a little bit more. I mean, they're really being laid down during this time of the age of the Amazon into this big lake bed that occurred in western Amazonia. And so this is, you know, about 23 million years ago. And then going to about 10 million years ago, we started to see sort of a shift. The Andes, as you can see, have uplifted even further. They're higher in elevation. And it's kind of tilting, so to speak, the continent. And as it's tilting the continent, basically the water system starts to move towards what we consider the direction of the Amazon River. And once it reaches sort of above about 2,000 meters elevation in the Andes, it's also reaching a really high height that's changing a lot the rainfall patterns. And so you are getting a much greater accumulation of rain along these Andes now that they've risen up so high, which is really laying in the sediments. As these really young mountains are, you know, letting go of a lot of their soil and so forth. So you're getting a lot of the Andean nutrients now beginning to flow into what is really now the Amazon River system. And let me see, I think here. So about 7 million years ago, more or less, it was at this point, a little bit to the west of Santarém, that it basically broke through, and the Amazon River started to flow out to the east as we know it today. And they base this on the fact that, you know, this is what they call a weakness in the shield, which had been sort of blocking the river from going. And they base it on the fact that this is the narrowest and the deepest part of the Amazon channel. Well, I think it's just the accumulation of all that water going through that essentially broke through whatever land barrier that was there, and that was believed to be right again, a little bit west of Santarém.
So that was 7 million.
It was, yeah, you know, geologists, give or take a couple of million years, probably. Yeah, just
Now I understand why paleontologists found huge sharks remains here.
Right. So let's see, we'll go back here. And so what we see about 2.5 million years ago really sort of matches what we think of the Amazon today. And one of the things I didn't point out earlier, but when you think about the Amazon back here, 60, 50 million years ago, up to 33 million years ago, you can see the purple dotted line there. That's what was sort of the approximate limit of Pan-Amazonia. In other words, you see it going all the way up, to the Santa Marta region of Colombia and so forth. It's much further north, it's much further west, and actually much further, or some further south than what it is today. And if you're interested in evolutionary diversification of groups and trying to understand how species are related to each other, at this time, before the Andes were formed, basically anything in wet forests right there along the Pacific coast, there's no barrier, to on the other side. So there were a lot of likely shared species. And then when the Andes rose and blocked that off, and the Amazon basin, pretty much like in these shots, it's a distinct sort of community from moist forest on the west side, then you would start to get diversification of those similar species that might have been on both sides in the past. And it's also worth noting that it was about, 10 million years ago, 7 million years ago, and maybe certainly by 2 million years ago, that this land bridge connection to Panama, Central America, and North America was essentially formed. So South America stopped being an island, basically somewhere between 7 and 5 million. And it depends on the dispersibility of organisms, whether they could cross, these little water barriers that might still be existing in Panama or in Costa Rica. But it was a complete land bridge by the time of 2.5 million years ago, allowing interchange of North American and South American fauna. So that's my quick geology history of the Amazon. And so let's talk about the Amazon today. And just very, it's like when I first went to the Atlantic forest of Brazil, and I say Atlantic forest without an S, and I quickly got corrected, and it's like the Atlantic forests of Brazil, because there are many different forest types within the Atlantic forest, and it's even more diverse, of course, within the Amazon. If you talk about the Amazon biome, you have hardwood palm swamp forest, you have palm swamp forest, you have flooded forest of different kinds, whether they're whitewater or blackwater or on clear water areas. You have upland terra firma forest, you have mangroves, you have savannas, you have white sand forest, you have these magnificent tapuis that just sit out on top in the Guianan Shield and other areas. Some of the examples of the flooded forest and the terra firma forest. So there's a lot of different forest types and patches, different kinds of patches throughout the Amazon, very much dependent on the soil drainage, what kind of soil is underneath, the geology, the rainfall, etc., that are going to shape essentially these kinds of forests that you have. And we know that the physical environment is certainly important in driving the distribution of organisms, as I mentioned, these ecosystems as well at various scales. And what's important for us to talk about, and we want to do a quick review on, is sort of the climate of the Amazon, as well as a little bit about the soil and the nutrient cycling regime, because these are two very important physical factors that influence what we see on the ground today in the Amazon. So, of course, I think everybody in the room knows the difference between weather and climate, but weather is, kind of what we're experiencing now, what we're experiencing in the short term, perhaps in the year. And so climate, on the other hand, is a kind of average weather condition we see, over longer time scales. And one thing I learned in Florida when I traveled around with John Dane and the Natural Resources Leadership Institute course, and we were talking about climate change with stakeholders across Florida, is if you don't talk about climate change and rather you talk about weather, then you can talk about climate change. Because that's how the people in Florida are really thinking about climate change, is how it's affecting them on kind of a day-to-day basis. on a year basis? What's the risk that they're going to have a hurricane? What's the risk that they're going to get flooded because of sea level rise and things like that? So sometimes it's interesting, it's important to recognize the difference, but sometimes when you're having conversation with people, what they understand is something that's more immediate, something that's short term, like weather. And you could talk about variation in weather. You could talk about the fact that, my God, the last few years have been so much drier than they ever were in my lifetime. Those are the kinds of conversations that are easy to have. But of course, let's think about climate, I think, in a longer term, because the longer term climate things are what's going to really shape the vegetation, the organisms, and the soils, its nutrient capabilities, and so forth. So when we think about, climate, and we're thinking about, let's say, climate over some time period, for example, in Toronto, Ontario, we all know, Toronto, of course, is very far north, that the kinds of variation you have in temperature across the year greatly exceed the variation you have in a single day. Okay, so that in January, you better bundle up, and in summertime, you can go to the beach, sort of thing. Whereas if we go to a place like Manaus, the kind of variation that you see in temperature, the daily variation in temperature often exceeds the yearly average variation in temperature. So you can go, to the beach or wherever, out to the river, it's going to look the same in January as pretty much it does in July in the Amazon, or certainly near the equator. So the broad generalizations we can make about the Amazon, or about the tropics in general, is that they're high and constant average temperatures. And this is taken from a website from the University of Wisconsin, where red is very hot and blue is colder. So you can see throughout, if you drew across the equator, that it's hot and it's relatively constant. And that generally many tropical environments, certainly in the Amazon, also tend to have high precipitation, although it can be very seasonal precipitation depending on where you are in the Amazon. And in the Amazon, the precipitation gradients have been roughly about 1,500 millimeters a year to about 3,000, maybe a little bit more, millimeters per year in the Amazon. And it really depends essentially on where you are. There are three, Leslie Holdridge in the 1970s, kind of a famous ecologist, kind of defined these sort of vegetation or life zones as a function of sort of three things: the precipitation, the humidity, and the potential evapotranspiration. And so when we look at the Amazon, we're basically finding ourselves down in this area here between what we might call a moist forest, a wet forest, and potentially a rainforest, depending on where you are. And, there's sort of arbitrary decisions. If it's, greater than 2,000 millimeters and potential evapotranspiration is such and such and such and such, then we'll call it a moist forest. But, the exact, what you call it is not so important. The important part is it's got this combination of generally high rainfall with low potential evapotranspiration ratios and high humidity. And that's where we find ourselves down in most of the Amazon forest sites. And of course, the weather pattern is, it's not just something, or climate, I should say, is not just something that's driven by local conditions. It's obviously influenced by sort of larger conditions, and even at the level of the globe. And so I think you all know that the Earth rotates and it's somewhat tilted, and the tilt changes depending on the time of the year. But when you think about this, and you think about how the sun's rays hit the globe, when you're at the equator, essentially the sun's rays are striking the Earth's surface perpendicularly, so more straight on, creating essentially more heat at any one location. And it's that kind of sun's rays hitting the Earth, as well as the rotation of the Earth, which affects essentially the kinds of winds that we have, and the winds, of course, are going to influence the rainfall patterns. So the green line is roughly the equator, and so what you have generally is, because of the rotation of the Earth, and I'm not going to go to this website, but you can click on this. We'll make this this PowerPoint available to you. You can click on that and go to see how the Earth rotates and so forth. But what you have is you have southeast trade winds and northeast trade winds, and they essentially hit each other at what's the intertropical convergence zone. And because of the way the Earth rotates, that zone essentially, the green is the equator, the red is the intertropical convergence zone. As the sun, or as the Earth kind of rotates and spins, that will change across the course of the year. So that sometimes it's a little bit higher, sometimes it's a little bit lower. The important thing when you're thinking about this is that these trade winds are essentially bringing water off the Atlantic and influencing the rainfall that occurs in the Amazon. And roughly about 50% of the water that comes on the Amazon is coming from essentially these trade winds. And so at a different time of the year, for example, the intertropical convergence zone shifts further north, and you can imagine those wind patterns change and the rainfall patterns would change along with them. So 50% of the rainfall is coming basically from the trade winds, and 50% of the rainfall in the Amazon roughly is coming from the trees themselves. The evapotranspiration from the trees is affecting rainfall in the Amazon basin. So in other words, so you've got these trees, and as these trees respire, its water vapor is essentially rising as transpiration. The water vapor, as it rises, is cooling as it gets higher in the atmosphere. As it cools, it condenses back to water and rains. So people have measured this in about 1980s or so and estimated, again, about 50% of the rainfall in the Amazon comes from that. However, and I'm not really going to be talking about deforestation or land use change or anything here, but this is a nice diagram because, I mean, I think it shows very well that as you cut that forest down, you have fewer trees respiring, and you have less water vapor essentially rising from the vegetation, and things begin to dry out. I mean, I remember when I was, again, a grad student back in Costa Rica, and I was working along an elevational gradient, and it was this narrow thing of forest that connected 2,000 meters all the way down to lowland forest. And all the land around outside the national park was essentially cut down. And the way that we'd get in and out of the site, we'd hike up and down that mountain, was that at the end of our trip, we'd hike out of the national park and then go to a bus station and then hitch a ride down to the biological station again. And it never failed. As soon as you had to take that 12-mile hike, or 12-kilometer hike, actually, this is sort of like my parents. Once you take that 12-kilometer hike out of the national park, as soon as you leave, it's been cloudy, it's been rainy, it's been miserable, you're carrying a 60-pound pack, the mud's up to your neck. As soon as you walk out into that pasture land, it's hot and sunny. And you sit there and you look back and you see all the clouds over the forest. And you go, boy, I wish we had some of that here. So anybody that's been in an area that has had deforestation, I mean, you see this. It's just a natural phenomenon, and about how the forest itself creates rain in a region, essentially. And I put this slide up here because there is a lot of variation in rainfall throughout the Amazon. I mentioned roughly 1,500 millimeters to 3,000 millimeters, and I put up some common sites. This is kind of a graph here showing some of the variation roughly in rainfall. Of course, there's lots of local variation as well, as affected by topography and so forth. But in a site like Manaus, you can see it's very seasonal across the year, with a pretty pronounced dry season in several months of the year that are on average below 100 millimeters of rain each year. You go to Iquitos, Peru, a little bit more in sort of western Amazonia, and the scales are roughly the same. You can see there's no month that's under 100 millimeters of rain a year. This is a pretty aseasonal forest. There is certainly some seasonality, but it's constantly, you can expect rain all the time. In our site in Yasuni area in Ecuador, western Amazonia, again, this is that 150 millimeter line. there's essentially no month of the year that has less than 150 millimeters. And we were there, and we say it's essentially aseasonal because it can be as rainy in January as it is in April, and every year it's very variable. So there is considerable variation across the basin in rainfall, and that is important in influencing plant growth, what organisms are there, the soil, you know, a variety of different sorts of important factors that drive what we see in terms of life in the Amazon. And like rainfall, there's no typical Amazonian soil or pattern of nutrient cycling. Both can be highly variable depending on the sort of the local conditions you're in, the spatial context, the temporal context. You know, what that land use has been perhaps prior to what it is now. That will vary a lot. A lot of the soils are like these oxazole soils. We'll talk about this in just a second. And then there are pockets, and I'm sure that we'll hear a lot more about this in the next couple of weeks and the next couple of classes. This dark earth, which is a very rich soil, which has had influence from past cultures affecting the soil. The nutrient cycling will come back to later as well. But one of the things that I typically do when I go to a new site in the tropics, people think I'm nuts, but one of the first things I do like the Tim Tebow, I get down on my knees. I do get down on my knees, and I feel the soil. And I touch the soil. I see what color it is. I see how many roots are there. I remember the first time I went to Manaus. I was used to Costa Rican soils, rich volcanic soils in relatively young Costa Rica, relatively rich soils. And then my other experiences were a little bit more in Colombia and then in Ecuador. And when I had a chance to go to Manaus and go to the biological dynamics of fragmented forest sites, you know, I looked around the forest and I went, oh my God, this is so different. There are like no flowering monocots, you know, very little flowering monocots, very little going on in the understory. And I said, what is happening here? And I went down on my knees and, you know, I tried to put my hand in the soil and I couldn't. I couldn't put my hand in the soil because it was absolutely covered with tiny rootlets, you know, from the trees and stuff like that. The soil was sandy, but it had this dense mat of essentially plant roots, which are just trying to get whatever nutrients there are at the very top right from the decomposing leaf. It is so different. And it told me so much about that forest. That was what made that forest and that vegetation different from what I was used to in Ecuador and in Costa Rica. So the first thing you should do is get down on your knees and check the soil out in a site, and you'll learn a lot from that experience. So soils can really vary a lot, and the soils, you know, the variation is due to the climate, how much rainfall, how hot it is, what's the topography of the area, or, you know, is there runoff coming from the Andes, you know, are you next to hills, and so there's lots of runoff and so forth. What the parent material is it, you know, relatively young parent material, or is it really old stuff? Like you get up, you remember the Guyana and the Brazilian Shield are higher elevation sites that are very old in the Amazon. So they've been very weathered over time, hundreds of millions of years. What's the biota? The biota will influence essentially the soils, the decomposers of the leaves and so forth, as well as what the trees are themselves and how loaded they are with secondary compounds or other things that protect them from being eaten and things like that. Those are all very important things. The age of the site, which I sort of just mentioned, as well as the human activities, which might, you know, shape the soil that you get in particular areas and might make it richer than a white might normally be. The size of the particles influence very much how nutrients are held or not held within the soils. And we can, you know, sand, silt, clay are, you know, three common kinds of, you know, material that you have. Sand is much bigger, you know, in size essentially than any clay particle. Clay particles, when you look across here, are the ones that have the largest surface area to volume ratio, which is important in taking up nutrients. Because of its acidity or its level of pH, it attracts positively charged ions which are really important for growth for plants, like phosphorus and calcium. And it also absorbs water better than sand or silt. Water will pass much more quickly through soil that has the texture of sand than it does of clay. So texture, besides color and whatnot, is very important. And the soil chemistry also very much influences essentially the nutrient availability. I'm sorry, can you see? The nutrient availability. And we break these soil up into sort of the macronutrients, which are needed in large amounts, like the phosphorus and the calcium, as well as the micronutrients that are needed in smaller amounts, like manganese or copper or other sorts of micronutrients. I have to point this just the right way. And when we think about, you know, it's you just can't grab an atom of calcium and bring it into your system. It's got to be in a certain form. And so essentially it has to be present in a water-soluble form for the plant roots to take it up. Okay, and so if you're able to hold water in your soil or not, then is important in the water availability and the potential for being able to grab on to these very important nutrients that you may need to bring into your system. And again, these we mentioned are positively charged, which is important for nutrient take-up as well. And so I mentioned the retention. Clay soils hold large volumes of water. Sandy soils do not. They tend to drain more quickly. And when you look at the Amazon, our kind of a real big generalization is that most of the more sandy soils tend to be on the eastern side of the basin. Okay, like in, getting into Manaus and further off that way, there's a lot of the more kind of clay soils, and this is just a broad generalization, tend to be more sort of on the western side. And this is, remember, all that stuff coming off the Andes is, a lot of this sort of the clay and other things. It's just generalization, which means then that if I had to generalize it, that sometimes the nutrient deficiencies are probably greater on the eastern Amazon basin side in general. Again, grain of salt. Okay, acidity is very important. There is, acid soils, as the pH gets lower, it becomes more acidic. As it rises, it becomes more alkaline. And there is kind of a pH level which is really good for picking up a lot of nutrients. So there's kind of an optimum. And that's usually about 6 to 7.2. And it has to do with the charge of the ions. Once it gets too acidic, it becomes almost impossible to essentially pick up the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium that's in the soil. And so that's why acidity and knowing the acidity of the soils is really important if you're trying to grow crops and what you need to add in terms of fertilizers, if you need to add fertilizers or other kinds of things that will help bring down the acidity, in other words, raise the pH in order to increase the ability for your plants to grow, or the case may be. So a little acidity promotes nutrient availability through the changing and being able to capture those particular atoms of the nutrients that you want. And again, acidity of a soil is very much influenced by heat and rainfall. If you've got bare soil and it's raining a lot and it's really hot, just over time that soil's become more and more acidic. It's just the way it works. So rainfall and temperature influence soil pH. Okay, so as again, there's no typical soil, but in general, the soils of the Amazon tend to be deeply weathered, highly acidic, and the chances of things that could leach through them, the nutrients that could leach through the soil, the chances of that can be really high. Most of the soils that make them sort of this red and yellow colored are these oxisols and these ultisols. And that's, there's different soil classification regimes. So sometimes you're going to hear these called exactly this. They'll be called, something different, but more or less the same, in somebody else's soil classification. But using this, about 50% of the soils are these deeply weathered acidic soils. And then you get some others like the entosols, which are younger, more recently deposited soils that are often carried by water. They're alluvial soils, so what you see along a lot of the major river courses. The ones that are going to be richer, of course, are those that are sediment laden, like along what we call the whitewater rivers, which I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about when we get to the system section on dams and so forth. But white waters are called that because they're loaded with sediment. It's generally coming off the younger areas, like coming off the Andes, like the Madeira River or the Solimois that goes into the Amazon. These are whitewater rivers that are carrying a lot of the sediment from geologically younger areas, and so they end up being some of the areas that are better for growing plants, essentially richer in nutrients. The alpha sols are often in montane areas. They're, again, younger soils, the least weathered soils, generally at the higher elevations of the basin. And then inceptosols are derived from volcanic eruptions. And so this is, for example, what we have a lot of the soils in Costa Rica were inceptosols. And the soil, this is a soil map, again, a very kind of broad 30,000 foot look at the soils. But again, just to show you that, you know, it's diverse. The soils that you run in across the Amazon are diverse, and it's affected by the river system, the rainfall, the geology, and so forth. So, you know, I guess if there's anything you get out of my talk today is that ecologists love variation. And then it's important to remember that things are variable, and that spatial and temporal context in which you're working, if you're working in Manaus, you know, it could be an entirely different, you know, setting, you know, 200 kilometers south. And so I think you have to respect that variability that exists in the system and understand that variability is really important to the system and to potential solutions in different areas. So it may not be the same solution, you know, in the north as it might be in the south, because of these underlying variances in physical and biotic conditions. And the variability in the soil quality, as this is what ecologists like to study, is it affects plant fertility, it affects phenology. Phenology affects perhaps the abundance of animals in an area and how far they need to range in order to meet their daily or their yearly sort of requirement. It affects essentially forest biomass and how fast trees can go. So you can go to a Manaus forest and see a tree about this size, and I can go to Western Amazonia and see a tree about this size, and they're probably the same age. You know, it's just that, you know, it affects how fast you grow, how dense maybe your wood is, you know, across different areas and so forth. So it affects the sorts of biomass and potentially carbon that could be held in systems as well. And it also affects where humans like to grow their crops. And I know we're going to hear a lot more about how traditional indigenous people really know the soils in the area and know what are the more richer spots to grow their crops than colonos that may have just been moved into the area from the northeast. They don't understand essentially the ecology of the soil. So it makes a big difference in their success, perhaps, in putting food on the plate. Back in the 80s, and so when I was a grad student, we also, you know, all these people were always asking this question, well, gosh, if the soils are so poor and it's such rotten conditions and all this other stuff, how can it be so green? How can it be so luxuriant? How can such life exist in these conditions that are so harsh? And the reason for that, as we understand it, is that most of the nutrients in these systems are in the living biomass, that they have very tight nutrient cycling. As I mentioned with the Manaus, is you capture those nutrients before they get a chance to get lost through the soil. So there are mutualists like mycorrhizal fungi, which play very important roles to help, so they can be inside the plant roots. They help in the transfer of essentially taking up those nutrients for the plants. I mean, there's these systems that have essentially evolved to make plants in these kinds of regions with very nutrient poor soils to be very good at what they do. to be very efficient at recycling the nutrients. One of my, things we always used to do with tropical biology courses is go ahead at the beginning of the course, take a few leaves, normally a variety of different plant species, ones that we know might be heavily loaded with secondary compounds, ones that we know that are not, and put them out in the forest and just watch them decay. And it's amazing how fast things decay in a wet tropical forest. In a temperate forest, these leaves can last on the ground for years. In the forest in Costa Rica, we used to say the half-life of a leaf, time it takes for it to be 50% gone, is about 2 weeks in the wet season. It is extremely rapid. And again, you see in places like Manaus, the little roots going directly into the leaves themselves, the tree roots going directly into the leaves, these decomposing leaves, to just grab those nutrients again as fast as you can.
That means every forest will come faster.
Well, we're going to get to that a little bit later, but there are also different strategies. There's slow strategies and fast strategies in terms of growth. And remind me if I don't mention that as we get to that just a little bit later. And so how do nutrients get back in the soil? Well, I kind of, there's all these different ways, but for us, and what's important here is this nutrient cycling and decomposition. And, the part of life that we know so very little about are really the bacteria and fungi and the smaller critters of the world that really help make this process happen. The diversity of these microbes in the soil is, way beyond our understanding and our ability to even name those things, let alone know that they're even there. So there's this very tight system of once a leaf falls on the ground, it gets broken down by all kinds of different organisms, including insects and microbes and, bacteria, fungi, and so forth. They then get picked up by the roots of the trees or rootlets of the trees, often helped by these things called mycorrhizal fungi or nitrogen-fixing bacteria in many of the legumes, and go right back up into the plant. So most of the nutrients are held themselves within the plants or within the root systems in the soil. And so when tropical forests then are burned to create an agricultural plot or burned for some other purpose, you are burning away that vegetation. So a lot of those nutrients then essentially go up in smoke and are lost from the system. Other of them settle down as the ash, and that does give a nutrient pulse to then what you might plant. But a lot of the nutrients are lost in that. You also end up with a lot of bare soil, so the chances of things that are going to be leached through the soil are also much greater because there's not that vegetation there to kind of capture it before it gets lost through the soil. So, the answer to Terburg's sort of paradox, of course, is these tight nutrient recycling systems that you find in the Amazon forest. Okay, so let's move along, I think, hopefully a little more quickly now and talk about the structure and dynamics of Amazon forest. And the tropical forests are very stratified. I mean, it's very unusual. You get to a forest and see like this cathedral forest where you get just huge trees and nothing in the understory. It's a mess. I mean, there are different layers, often thick understories, some sort of mid or sub-canopy layer, then a canopy layer, and then you get these big emergents like ceiba or dipteryx or other Brazil nut trees that stand way above everything else and stand out above the crowd. And this stratification actually helps you to, have more species packed into a forest. If you're an ecologist and you think about how do I, you've got this little groups that have their little niches, how do I pack more into something? Well, one way to pack more species in is to make them more specialized. And so they specialize, for example, of only being on the ground, or only being found 5 meters high, or only being found basically in the subcanopy. So these little ant wrens, which I showed at the very beginning of the talk, in our Amazon forest, the way we can fit so many in there and they don't necessarily outcompete each other is the way that they stratify the forest. And they essentially divide it up into different sections. So this sort of stratification helps to maintain diversity, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but helps to maintain diversity within tropical forests. It creates all these ecological niches, more niches than would be available if you walked into one of the forests here in Florida or further north. A second sort of general statement, so what I'm going to give you is a few general statements about these rainforests or Amazon forests. Within a location, this is kind of like the, you know, conventional wisdom. Most species are rare and a few species are common. So this has come from some bird surveys that we've done in Ecuador. This is, if you line up the species based on their abundance, these are the most abundant species, these are the least abundant species. We have 300 species of birds that we can get within a 1 square kilometer area in our forest that we can see, that we have seen within a 1 square kilometer. That's a lot of bird species. But you can see that somewhat less than 25 of them, we get a lot of them. So of these 25 species, you know, we can see 200 or more. Okay? But most of the species, we're down below seeing 50, and many of them were down below seeing 10. So there are lots of rare species and few common species. This is a pattern you see over and over and over again. This is an example from some trees. These are families of trees rather than individual species. There are few common families like legumes and the Brazil nut family and the Sapataceae, where individuals within those families, you can actually find quite a few individuals generally, but then there are a lot of others that are really rare. This last bar was represented by 43 other plant families. So this is a very common kind of pattern that you see.
Could you hypothesize why that is?
I'm going to come to that in just a minute. Yeah, it has a lot to do with species interaction, which is what I'm going to talk about. And so tropical forests are characterized by interactions. What drives abundance of organisms, what drives often where they're found, how long they live, how much they recruit, is often driven by species interactions. As you get further north into temperate zones, you have that real great variation in temperature over the course of a year. And so organisms in temperate zones tend to be driven a lot more by the physical environment as compared to organisms in the tropics. And that's a generalization. But it generally tends to be true. You've got a lot of really co-evolved, or at least natural selecting, operating on species interactions. And one of my favorite ones is seed dispersal mutualisms. So when you look in these tropical forests, vertebrates, meaning bats and birds and monkeys and lizards, animals with backbones, are primarily responsible for dispersing the seeds from almost, in some cases, 90% of the plant species that are found in tropical forests. And there are great diversity of these vertebrates that have become largely specialized on feeding on fruits, including fishes, which are very important in the Amazon forest for dispersing seeds of many of the trees that are found in either flooded forests or along river courses. And in many of these cases, the animals are just feeding on the flesh part of the fruit and then spitting out the seed or defecating the seed, and of course that's where a seedling comes from. So there's this mutualism, plants providing food for the animals, animals providing the gardening services, the recruitment services, plant regeneration services for the particular plants. And so plants largely depend, and there are exceptions, of course, the wind dispersed things like kapok, sativa trees, but plants largely depend on animals for seed dispersal recruitment. And why is that? Because these seeds can be greatly limited by light, which I'll come to in a minute. They can be greatly limited by the soil nutrients or other sorts of microsite conditions where those seeds land. Predators and pathogens are really important, and that gets back to the abundance question. And then, of course, there could be great competition among things to recruit into the environment. And one of the most important sort of hypotheses out there for ecologists came about from Dan Jansen in 1970 and Joe Connell 1 year later, called the JansenConnell Hypothesis. And it's sort of the dogma of tropical forest. And that is, if you have a tree and it produces all these seeds, that essentially many of the seeds land close to the tree. So more seeds, you get a greater density of seeds here, and then animals may disperse them, and so you get a lower density of seeds as you go further and further away from the tree. And many have looked at the survivability of those seeds underneath the tree versus farther away. And you've got a much greater probability of surviving if you get taken away from the crown of that tree. And the reason for that are what we call these distance and density dependent mortality. And so predators and pathogens, predators of those seeds or fungi or whatever, things that attack those seeds, they know where to look. And they find a much greater chance of finding those seeds when they're in high density and when they're close to the tree. And things that end up being common, you end up having more predators and pathogens that feed on those things. So the common, so you don't get as many common. Okay, here we go. It does not want to go forward.
Maybe I'll just wait.
Oh, that was awesome.
Uh-oh.
Let's not do that. Let's go back to the PowerPoint slideshow. Is that PowerPoint slideshow? Yeah. Let me do this. There we go. Okay, and then the other thing that's really important is light environments. So in a rainforest, you generally have a pretty tightly packed canopy. And there's very little light. So this is the height above ground, and this is the amount of light, essentially, that any tree will see. When you're down here in the understory, you have very, very little light. And generally, light is needed for photosynthesis. It's needed for growth. And so seeds, of course, most of them, unless they're epiphytes and they land up in the canopies, they're down in very low light environments. So often their chances of success or recruiting can be very low. Many of them are light dependent. And so animals as dispersers can bring them into basically tree fall gap areas that have more light. So animals as dispersers can help seeds colonize these areas that are quote unquote safe for germination and establishment. And I put that's a very big wave because there's lots of trade-offs and variability in seed size and your ability to recruit by light. Another fourth thing I would say is that these tropical forests, as we know, are characterized by high local as well as regional diversity. And let me explain that in just a second here. Let's see if I can get the next slide.
Work.
In this cupboard? I think we need something to turn that on.
Oops. We're using it before.
All right. If sometimes the arrow key works and sometimes it doesn't. Sorry, guys. All right. So sort of local tree diversity again. This shows the diversity gradient. Oops. No, that's great. It does work. Thanks. Marianne's moving me along, which I agree.
Sorry. No.
And
you have plenty of time.
But these are sites in Panama. You can see as you get basically into Amazonia sites, you really increase in diversity. These numbers you shouldn't mess around with because these numbers don't necessarily mean a whole lot because they're representing different areas. Okay, it's just the pattern that's important here. Bird species, all of North America. There's almost more species at our 15 square kilometer site in Yasuni. There are about 600 species there than in all of North America alone. So diversity is really great. I think we all understand that. I'm sure we're going to get a better number of the fish in the Amazon later on. The mammals, of course, incredibly diverse. Over 100 species of bats in the area where I work. My point here is we know that diversity is there. What we don't understand is how that diversity turns over. So here's our two plant books. This is from Al Gentry, and it's for Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. This is the Flora Reserve Duque in near Manaus, or right outside Manaus. And when I went to the Tiputini area, I love this book. This is a great book. And I asked Robin Foster, who's a botanist at the Field Museum, I said, how useful is that book going to be for me in Western Amazonia? How much overlap is there between Manaus and Western Amazonia? He said, well, maybe 25%. So there's this great turnover in what trees or what primates or what birds are present throughout the Amazon. It's very easy to think it's all the same. It's not all the same. Evolutionary processes, diversification, they're taking sort of different routes in different parts of the Amazon, and you're getting species that are closely related, but they're different from each other. And different in a variety of different ways. They may just be different from their molecules, but they're also likely different in their function and in their morphology, and how they are seed dispersers or decomposers or something like that. Terry Irwin is someone I've learned a lot from. He's at the Smithsonian Institution. He does canopy fogging. And he is one of these guys that made a very controversial statement back in the 1980s that, we have 1.4 million described species on the planet. And there's a lot we don't know, And he made some estimates based on fogging a canopy tree where he found 43 different, I forget exactly how many species he found. But he estimated, okay, given that number of insects in that one canopy tree of that one species in Panama, I'm guessing that about 13% of those species are specialized. In other words, they only feed on the leaves of that particular plant species. And then there are X number of tree species out there. He estimated essentially there are 30 million species on the planet. Now, he said that was just a back of an envelope thing, and he was really sad it got as much attention as it did. But the point is there's a lot of diversity we don't know, and there's a lot of species that are very specialized and live in, very restricted ranges. So that diversity, I would argue, in the Amazon is greatly underestimated, even in things we know well, like birds. Greatly underestimated, the diversity that exists, because their populations on one side of the river versus the other side of the river, they're totally separate. Speciation is a process, okay? It's not static. Things are changing all the time. And so it's important to remember that. And it's important to remember that it's not the same patch of forest in Western Amazon as it is in the Eastern Amazon. And our site, where he's done canopy fogging, he's got over 100,000 insect species in the size of 100 meters by 100 meters in size. Amazing thing. He focuses on a beetle called agra, by the way. And he's got so many agras, he has fun naming them. So one's aggravation, another one's agricadabra, another one is agra-rider, after Winona Ryder. He had a crush on Winona Ryder. So there's lots of diversity. And I like this thing that came out relatively recently, what they call a sort of phenogram or phenoregions. And they took some remote sensing images of NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which some of you might know about. And they used those images to sort of map the phenology regions in the Amazon, and they found 24 different phenology regions. And basically what that is regions that, if you look at the light gray bars, those are the regions where there's a peak in leaf phenology. And you can see as you go across the Amazon, I labeled some of these sites, is that peak in leaf phenology, one, can be in different months, it could be longer or shorter. Those kinds of things are really important for influencing the productivity of a forest, its carbon dynamics probably, as well as the diversity of the forest, because the leaf phenology is really the basis for a lot of the insects, which is the basis for a lot of the birds and the primates and other things that feed on the insects and so forth. So it's a really variable environment. This is a graph from the same paper that shows sort of how the seasons change. So the rainy season peak, is a little bit earlier in the year in sort of in the sort of southeast region, and then there's kind of a wave as it goes across to the northwest. So there's also the changes, the seasonal changes are quite different depending on where you are in the Amazon, and that has implications as well. So let's finish up quickly here with, you know, why this diversity is so much higher in the tropics than higher latitudes. And let's just go back a little bit on the origins of the diversity. So I mentioned, so 65 million years ago, South America was an island, but there was a lot of forest there. There was the sort of the inland sea, the wetland areas, and so forth. But a lot of the tree species, a lot of the palms, which are distributed throughout the tropics, they're already there. So the species that arrive to the Amazon often can have a really ancient lineage. For me, you know, that, especially when you work with birds, was a little bit controversial, because a lot of us believe that the effects that happened in the Pleistocene with glaciation and it contracted, so we believe, contracted forests in the Amazon, this all happened, you know, in the last million or so years. We thought that that was where a lot of the diversity originated from. Well, that's not really the case. Now that we're looking at the molecules of these organisms, we find that their origin is usually much before the Pleistocene. So these geological, my main point is these geological events are very important in influencing basically how diversity originated in the Amazon. As I mentioned, you know, there's the great American exchange when South America became connected to Central America and North America. Some things moved south, some things moved north, some things couldn't cut across those divides. That was a very important time, essentially, in the diversification of life in the Amazon. And there are probably about 30 different hypotheses that explain tropical diversity, either the origin of that diversity or the maintenance of that diversity. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to say one, and that is a sort of the climatic change hypothesis and the climatic stability hypothesis. Some people thought, well, you know, in some of these areas that were really old, and so you had forests there for a really long time. And that would have been more like eastern Amazonia, where it wasn't covered by that wetland area that I showed earlier. That, you know, that was out there in that forest, and that was in forest a lot longer than western Amazonia. Well, if you look at the patterns of diversity, and this is tree diversity, so where the dots are bigger, it's more diverse, you see the areas that are higher diversity tend to be in the west. So right there, it should tell you that climatic stability argument doesn't hold. You know, it may hold for some, but it doesn't hold for others. So western Amazonia ends up actually often having higher local diversity than does eastern Amazonia. It also gets higher rainfall, has higher productivity, and those could be a lot more of the explanations for the diversity. It's also right next to the Andes, and so that could influence that diversity as well. The other thing that helps maintain diversity and might also help explain diversity are these niche differences that we talked about earlier. You know, if you're an insect, if you're specialized, you know, you feed on only particular plants, so you can pack more insects into the system. Or flowers come in all different kinds of sizes and shapes, so you specialize to certain kinds of flowers and so forth. And plants likewise, it's not just, we often think about pioneer plants and shade-tolerant plants. And pioneer plants are like the Cecropia or the Bismia, that when you open an area, they can grow really fast and come up into those high light environments. And then you've got the shade-tolerant things that tend to have larger seeds. They can sit in the understory with 1 or 2 leaves. They can be, you know, this tall and 40 years old. And then when the conditions become right, then, you know, they'll start to grow. Well, the point is, there's not the 2 extremes. There's a whole gradient. You know, if you start looking at the optimum light for trees to grow, they fit across that whole gradient. The optimum nutrients for trees to grow, they fit across that whole gradient. So there are probably more defined niches within plants as well. It's not to say if you give them more light, they won't grow better, but there is that gradient. But nonetheless, you know, so this is the JansenConnell coming back to that, is that things that are common tend to get more predators and pathogens sort of lining up on them to eat, which creates opportunities then for rare individuals to become established. So these species interactions are important. These trade-off between survivorship and growth is one big, wide example. So species that tend to be really good dispersers, small seeds, for example, they can go a long way, or they can temporarily, they're dormant, so they can stay in the soil for years. You know, they can live in one spot for a long time. So those are sort of good dispersers, but they often may be poor competitors. So you put them up against, one of these shade-tolerant trees, then, they may outcompete them. So there's these trade-offs. And then, of course, there are neutral mechanisms, just the lottery event. You just happen to be the one seed that ended up in this spot at just the right time. It's just by chance you got landed there. And so neutral mechanisms are probably also at play. So there's, a gazillion different hypotheses for explaining the maintenance and, in some cases, the origin of tropical diversity. So let me end with about 3 slides. Sorry, I'm kind of going over here. But Kent Redford was really important, and Marianne, I think, mentioned him last week. You certainly mentioned John Robinson, but was really important in the formation of the Tropical Conservation and Development Program. He was in wildlife ecology, it wasn't called that then, but he was in wildlife ecology back in the early 90s, and then he moved on to Wildlife Conservation Society. He's just recently retired from Wildlife Conservation Society. He published a really important paper, at least, in 1992 in Bioscience. And I just want to bring it up because, I work in a forest that is basically undisturbed in many ways, 1.7 million hectares in size. And, you see all the trees and everything, and you think everything is perfectly fine. Well, again, species interactions, it may not be perfectly fine. He talked about, in this case, that in some areas you lose some of the large animals in the system, the jaguars, the tapirs, the white-lipped peccaries, and things like that. That when you lose some of these things, you lose the seed dispersers. You lose those top predators. You lose species that are really important to the functioning of that forest. And so it's important, I think, for those of us, when we think about forests and we think about the long-term integrity of those forests, is that because species interactions are so important in these forests, that we don't forget those. You can substitute for those. It's not to say that you can't make a forest function, but a forest would probably need more management, if you were going to try to maintain its diversity, if you lose many of the active players in the system. And let me give you one example from work that we did, the Royal We, a PhD student of mine, and we worked at 2 stations in the Yasuni area in Ecuador, Tiputini, which has no hunting going on at all anywhere near the area, and the Yasuni station, which does have hunting going on, Guarani communities that have been settled along an oil company road. So they've actually changed their hunting patterns a lot because of the oil. That's not so important for this story, but they're hunting in Yasuni, and the abundance of large frugivores like toucans and arasaris and spider monkeys and woolly monkeys are way down at this station. So hunting has impacted the abundance. It hasn't caused any of them to go extinct, but it's impacted the abundance. The Varroa tree, or the nutmeg, and the Marissa casei is almost primarily dispersed by these large toucans and these large primates. And so what we did is we looked at the seed dispersal, how far, remember I said it's important how far seeds move away from a plant for their survival probability in this hunted and non-hunted site. And the canopy crown of these things, and we did this 2 different ways. We did by radio tracking and knowing how long it takes for seeds to pass through a system. We also did by molecular genetic techniques. So we took seeds and seedlings and found out who their mother was. Okay, so paternity analysis, just like with O.J. Simpson. And so then we found out how far away there was effective seedling recruitment, essentially, from the parents. This is most seeds in the hunted site don't move any more than 100 meters away from the parent. Whereas the long distance dispersal event and the tail of that dispersal event is much greater in the area where you still have good populations of toucans and primates. That has all kinds of implications for the distribution, the genetic diversity of the trees. I mean, all kinds of implications down the road, but likely we won't see those consequences until 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, because of the long life of these trees. And then my last thought is climate change. And this thing came out in the Trends for Ecology and Evolution in 2009, and is really talking about temperate systems. But it really made me think. So if you are trying to track changing climates, the world is getting hotter. The best thing for you to do is to go up the mountain a little bit, okay? And if you can go up the mountain a little bit, in 167 meters up in elevation, you could track that optimum temperature for you, a 1 degree centigrade change, let's say. All you got to do is move 167 meters up the mountain. Yet, if you're in the lowlands in the Amazon, and you're trying to track that, they call this the altitude for latitude disparity. You know, in the temperate zone, and I don't know what it would be actually in the Amazon, that same shift, you would need 145 kilometers to move. So if you're a good disperser and you still got those toucans and hornbills or, you know, whatever, these big large tapirs, you know, that can move you longer distances, then maybe you'll be okay. But if you're not a good disperser, you have got to move further if you're trying to match some optimum in temperature. And this, so species in the lowlands are going to have a much harder time of it with climate change. And not only that, when you look at the Amazon and you look at the predicted changes in temperature in the Amazon, it's going to be hotter now in the Amazon than it's ever been in the last at least 3 million years. Okay, so will organisms be able to adapt? And one thing we know about trees is there is an optimum temperature at which they photosynthesize. And that curve looks something like this. And then the respiration goes something like this. So at some point, you get above the optimum and you shut down. You stop photosynthesizing. You close those stomata because you don't want to lose any more water. Your respiration goes up. You're hitting a death zone at that. And so they're finding that a lot of trees, because of the higher temperatures, are dying. Okay, there's greater mortality in the trees because they're going above that optimum that they could survive at. And so, as I mentioned, we work in Yasuni in an area that is essentially, it's got everything. It is undisturbed where we work. It's just massive amount of forest, no hunting. 2009, we've been working on the birds, and this is either by capture, by observation, so this is canopy birds, all birds, and this is by capture, so birds in the understory. You can see there's a lot of variability, but in 2009, everything started to go down. And I mean everything started to go down. We have maybe 1 or 2 species in 300 that are going up. Everything went down. It's a directional change. I expect population variation like this. I don't expect a directional change in the forest that looks perfect. And what it is this is ENSO events. And when this is like basically an average year, and when you get above this right here, this is reflecting La Nina years. La Nina years in our area have lots of rainfall. And when you look since 2009, all of the years, and some of them have been really strong La Nina years. And when we look at these community-wide changes, and granted it's only a correlation, but it correlates with a time lag with these La Nina years. And I've talked to colleagues now, after this paper just came out, and I've talked to colleagues from other areas throughout the tropics, and they're seeing the same thing. And so I believe we're seeing the consequences of climate change happening in this really undisturbed forest in the Amazon. And we don't understand the mechanism. We have lots of hypotheses about what the mechanisms are, but I think one of them likely has to do with resources. That when it rains as much as it does, it's probably, and our insectivores, those that feed on insects, are hit more. It's reducing the resources available for them. We don't think the adults are dying. We think they just can't raise babies. And the recruitment is down low for them. We don't think it's necessarily adult mortality. So with the change in short-term weather patterns, maybe, it will come back and we'll see populations again rise. So I want to leave you with those thoughts, and I'm sorry, I went on a long time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Betty. You can see I gave her a huge task, and look what she did with it. We can take a few questions.
That was 65 million years. I think you're next.
Thank you.
I have a question about just secondary growth. I don't know if it's changed like in different tropical regions of Amazon the genetic pasture or
Yeah,
there's an issue.
right. And I think this whole, from a natural regeneration sort of process these things, I think this bit about secondary forests is a really interesting question. Again, and it really, you get your thoughts about it get shaped by the forest that you know. And being in the forest in Costa Rica, for example, there's not a day that goes by that you don't hear a tree come down. It's a very dynamic forest. We all know that, or many of you know that the trees tend to have really shallow roots, really wet forests, there's huge accumulation of stuff that grow in the branches, epiphytes, mosses, things like that. Things just fall down. And for any particular spot in Costa Rica, on average, there'll be a tree fall like every 100 years. So there's like a turnover of 5% in that forest. And then you go to a place like Manaus, where there's not as much rainfall, so there's not as much accumulation perhaps of epiphytes and things. And we thought, well, maybe there's just, differences in the dynamics of natural succession. So when you get these big trees fall down, of course, you open a gap and new things recruit, the pioneer species and so forth. So we sort of thought the dynamics of maybe what's happening like an area like Manaus might be different than an area like Western Amazonia or Costa Rica that receives more rainfall and probably has a higher turnover of trees due to just things falling down. Yet in the Amazon, in Manaus, and now I've experienced it also in Western Amazonia, some of you probably know, you can get these big wind throws, where the wind just really comes through and opens up these huge gaps and like 20 trees fall at once, or things like that. And I don't know the frequency of those kinds of processes, but similar kinds of processes are going on. How fast things grow, I think, really is very species specific in terms of the trees. I mean, we have seen Cecropia trees just come up and be 7 meters high in a year, and I've seen that in a variety of different forests. So I don't know if I can answer that question other than I think that you will find ecologically equivalents that in open areas can grow really pretty quickly. One other example, if I can give it, is in the biological dynamics of fragmented forest sites. I mentioned the history matters. And so that was the area where they artificially cleared forest patches and then had cattle around them. Then the money ran out. And they could no longer keep the cattle on, so they went back to sort of natural regeneration. It mattered whether that landowner had burned his land or didn't burn his land. In areas, and I don't know if I remember it right, areas that weren't burned, the Cecropia came up. Areas that were burned, it was a monoculture of Bismia that came up. So the history of that land would matter as well. But I think it's the sort of, my point being, it's the sort of, you have to think about the long-term history that would have driven the sorts of growth strategies that trees might have had in an area. And in long-term history, I would be thinking about soil nutrients and turnover dynamics. What's the average time that something turns over? And that's going to give you sort of the selection pressures that you would need. So if you're in an area that has lots and lots and lots of turnover, then the chances you're going to end up in a gap, or your seed's going to end up in a gap, are going to be higher than an area that has slow turnover. And so that would drive selection for plants to have growth strategies that could take advantage of that dynamics of a forest. And so you could see changes over evolutionary time as a function of really those historical components. Did that answer the question?
Or diverse and high, or less diverse, because concerned about competition, more about.
And you hit right on Connell's intermediate disturbance hypothesis. The answer most people think is somewhere in the middle. So if it's really highly turnover a lot, you'll have lower diversity. If it turns over really infrequently, you have low diversity. It's somewhere in the middle there that you likely get the highest diversity, because you get this real mix of things that are growing fast, growing slow, in the intermediate stages.